All right, let's do this. So, hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. Luke Evans, we're here to talk about taking an infrastructure as code approach to Microsoft 365. First off, as ever, thanks to our sponsors. I'm sure you've heard them all today. I'm probably not going to read each and every single one out. They did ask us to do that, but I'm probably going to give it a miss. Again, we've got another sponsor slide. Thanks to all these guys. Without these guys, it wouldn't be possible to have events like this. So I'm ever so grateful to all the sponsors who allow us to do these great things. First off, I know I love talking about myself, but I'll probably take it a bit easier today. 16 years in Microsoft Technologies. I spent about 6 at Microsoft doing Sharepoint, so my background is collaborative in nature. I don't know, feel free to come on in. I'm fairly flexible. I like to keep things fairly chill, so don't worry too much. Since then, I've been currently working as a solutions architect across numerous, I guess, M365 projects is probably the best way of putting it. Now, I do have a tendency to go quite quickly, so if you have anything that you want to say, any questions along the way, then please feel free just to interject, and I'd rather, have it out rather than me just rant and rave at you. This is the first time I've demoed this topic, so I would be eager to kind of get your feedback and see what you guys think. I'm still working on the timing, so let's see how we go. I appreciate I'm the last slot of the day, so I don't want to keep you guys forever. So I'm hoping to keep it 30, 40 minutes with some room for questions. All right, first off, when I was thinking about this topic, some of the things I thought about were the challenges that were faced typically when dealing with Microsoft 365 administration. And for me, there's a lot of challenges that we face today as administrators. We've got tons of ever-changing admin centers. Things are constantly evolving, constantly changing. I mean, we've got renames coming out of the woodwork. I think on top of that, say you don't want to do the UI, you want to take a more PowerShell-driven kind of way of kind of managing your tenant. We constantly have churn in terms of the PowerShell modules that are available to us. So we've seen go from Azure Id or we had the original MS Online, we've gone to Azure Id. On top of that, we're going to Graph off the back of that now. So we're constantly changing the PowerShell modules that are available to us, and trying to keep on top of that can prove quite challenging. I think when we start talking about, I don't know how many people here work for an MSP or a consultancy, you probably deal with a large number of tenancies and try to configure them at scale can prove difficult. Yeah, so how do I do this across multiple tenants? I think one of my biggest bugbears is probably no version history. So say I'm working in Intune, for example, I make a change to a policy, there's no easy way of replaying and seeing what happened with that. Yeah, so I can't go back in time and look unless I'm performing backups of that and understanding how it's all structured. We've got multiple administrators making changes constantly. So, when you're working in a team, often, unless you're a one-man band, you're going to have people making changes across the tenant. And it can prove, I guess, difficult and tricky to understand who's changed what at any given point and why they made that change. I think on top of that, our configurations options are constantly expanding. Yeah, so we constantly have new options available and new kind of settings that we can mess with. So, for example, we've just got B2B Direct Connect for shared channels has just come out. And it's a brand new piece of functionality. Again, these just add to the complexity and actually how we admin Microsoft 365. Now, thinking this through, I think one of the things that I gravitate towards is I like, and I was looking, how do we solve this? One of the things I do outside of kind of Microsoft 365, I typically play with infrastructure as code. And, I use it for provisioning VMs using Terraform. I use Ansible for configuration management. And for me, I wanted to take this and kind of apply this to Microsoft 365 and how can we use this technology to, I guess, make our lives easier. And for me, infrastructure as code, for people that might not be aware, I think the simplest way of describing it is your configuration, or your kind of configuration is described using, let's see. So it means to manage your IT infrastructure using a configuration file. It's probably the simplest way. So whatever you've got configured, however you set it up, it's just laid bare in a piece of text, really. So it's very easy to kind of read it and understand it, hopefully. But the key there is that we can use this concept of having a configuration file, and we can use this to basically manage our IT infrastructure. Now, this has really come about from cloud computing. It's probably the key way of saying it. So I would say the AWS is really what kind of helped drive this forward. Cloud computing such as that, and the ability to rapidly provision resources in a consistent fashion is where we got infrastructure as code. Now, for me, some of the quick benefits that we probably do, infrastructure as code, faster speed and consistency. If we have a configuration file that we're applying, we can apply that rapidly and easily in a consistent fashion. Minimization of risk, we know exactly what's going to change. It's not clicking the UI and hitting save, for example. Management overhead, I think one of the key things here is that we're trying to get the people that actually make the changes, the developers, for example, in infrastructure as code. We're trying to cut out the middlemen and some of the management overhead of having someone apply the changes for us. The idea here is that we have checks and balances, and we can basically use that to basically apply this to, development, test, and then production using stage gates. And cost savings, the idea here is that if you're making it easier, you're making it quicker, you're reducing management overhead, we can basically reduce the costs associated with it. Now, this is where I kind of take a leap of faith, and one of the main ones for me is that we have a tool that we can use called Microsoft 365 DSC. Now, this is an open source module, and it's basically available for PowerShell 5.1. It's available in the PowerShell gallery. It's built on PowerShell DSC. Now, you might say, what is DSC? Because I've just used the abbreviation. It means desired state configuration. And I'll talk through what does that actually look like in a bit, but it's declarative in nature. And I'll come to that one on the next slide. What does declarative mean? And the real key here is when we're talking about 365 DSC, we're dealing with configuration and structure. So we're dealing with how we've configured our environment, how we've set it up, what are the settings we've applied. And we're not dealing with so much the content within a tenant is the important thing. So that's really what we're looking at. And I think I've pulled out 6 of the key pillars. Now, I have to say that the 365 DSC site was wonderful in helping me put this together. But my plan was to run you through these and quickly talk you through how DSC can help you automate, monitor, export, compare, clone, and report on your tenant. Now, so the very first thing we wanted to talk through is declarative versus imperative. So declarative, and this is where DSC really shines, is what we're doing is we're really telling what we want our configuration to be. We don't care so much as to how it is today. It's more about, this is what I want it to be. And, I don't really care what the steps you do to get me there. That's really the difference. And imperative is on the right, so we have imperative on the right. And this is maybe more a traditional kind of PowerShell management way of doing things. So we're saying I want a new meeting policy. And if you say run this once, it will apply that meeting policy. But if you run it twice, it's going to error out and say it already exists. So that's really the difference between them. Declarative, and let's give it a shot. It's impodent, I think is the word I'm looking for. I tried to look it up on YouTube previously to this, and it was trying to get the pronunciation right. But what that means is we can apply it as many times as we like, and the end result is going to be the same. So that's the real key difference here, is we're more telling DSC what we want it to look like, what is the end state, what is our desired state configuration, and we don't really care about the ins and outs of how we get there is the important thing. Now, first and foremost, I'm going to just talk through the pillars of kind of DSC and what do they actually look like and how can we use this tool to, I guess, make our lives easier. So the first one is automate. Now, we can, it's all right. And the first thing is we can use DSC to automate the deployment of configuration across multiple Microsoft 365 workloads. Now, I've just pulled out a few that you can use, but the idea here is that we can define our configuration in a single file, like we saw previously, and on the back of that, we can either have a single file or we can chunk it up. So if I wanted to have a section that was, say, SharePoint Online or Power Platform, we can have that as a separate configuration file. It's stored as a PS1 by default, but it is just kind of a JSON array, really. If you're familiar with JSON, that's what it looks like. The key there is that we're defining it up front, and we're letting the tool kind of apply that logic for us. Now, this is kind of the behind-the-scenes piece. We have DSC. It really acts as an abstraction layer, is the important thing. And it's in front of all the modules and APIs that we have to deal with as an administrator. So, like I said earlier, we've got, Exchange Online, Microsoft Teams. We've got the Graph API now. We have Azure Id, PowerShell PnP. And for us, in terms of DSC, we don't really care too much about, I want to define my configuration up front, my desired state. And at that point, I want to let the tool kind of be the abstraction layer and deal with the logic behind the scenes and kind of automate that for us. So Graph API, you're going to deal with Azure AD, PowerShell PnP, SharePoint, Exchange Online Management, that's going to go deal with Exchange, and Teams is going to deal with Teams. Now, one of the really cool things is if you install kind of Microsoft DSC from the PowerShell Gallery, it's going to install all these dependencies automatically for you, which was a godsend to me. Because imagine trying to keep track with all these in terms of the different modules that we're using and what to use today versus what we're using tomorrow. It automates a lot of that for you. So it installs all these dependencies and you're ready to rock and roll. Now for me, that's really powerful because it makes your lives easier in terms of getting up and running. But a lot of the time you're thinking about, what would I think about? We've got a configuration. And I think one of the key challenges I call back to was the admin one, and how do we understand, what's happening to our tenant and how is that being affected on a day-to-day basis? Are people making changes? And that's where the next kind of proponent comes in. One of the key things with DSC is that it basically has a continuous check running in the background, and it's called a consistency check. So we're constantly polling on what our desired state is and what our actual state is. And basically it's continuously checking. I think it's 15 minutes by default, but you can expand it up to, I think, 30 days, so a consistency check every 30 days if you want. Now, the idea here is that it's going to check what is your desired state, what do we ask it to be, and what is our actual state that's actually in the tenancy is the important thing. Now, when a change is detected, so if we find a configuration drift, for example, we can do a number of different things are available to us. So if, say, I've defined a meeting policy, and we are saying, or actually, we'll do a SharePoint sharing one, actually. That's a bit easier, a bit more familiar to me. So if we do a SharePoint sharing policy, and we don't allow, external sharing, anonymous external sharing, and someone flips that setting on, we can get acted on that, and we can choose what we want to do based upon that. Now, these are kind of the ones that we have. So we've detected configuration drift. What do we want to do? Now, the first one is we don't really do anything. We can just have it as is and just let it be. We can just apply our original desired state and basically not make any changes to that configuration drift. Yeah, so the first one is basically not do really anything. The second is really kind of monitor. So we can apply and monitor. That's what it's called in terms of the technical terms. And basically, we can log any configuration drifts is the important thing. So say that setting has changed, we can log that and basically alert us to that change. So if someone has, say, flipped an anonymous sharing back on, we can be alerted to that. The final one, and this is a bit more dangerous, is the autocorrect. So we can have a desired state, we can have people making changes in the UI, for example, and at that point, what might happen is that we can have that automatically corrected. Now the reason, so it can look at the desired state and basically just overwrite the changes. So our desired state is always taking place. Now, this is a bit dangerous because you've got to be careful of what you autocorrect is probably the most important thing I'd say here. You may, and this is where it gets a bit trickier, so you may want to break down your configuration to elements where you do want to autocorrect versus ones that you don't want to. So it may be that, and a bad example is maybe you define a bunch of Teams channels in a DSC file. I typically wouldn't go to that low level, but you could define a bunch of channels up front in a team and say the team owner goes and deletes them or renames them. What could happen at that point is that it could basically recreate them after 15 minutes. So you kind of ended in a cycle that's quite painful. So you want to be careful with what you autocorrect, but there are a number of settings that you probably choose that you would just go autocorrect automatically. The next one is probably export in terms of the next pillar of DSC. And yeah, okay, all right, cool. The next one is export. And what we're looking to do here, and this is probably the first one that you'll probably have a go with, but say you have a tenant, say you like the look of it, you can export and extract that config. And I think I remember reading or watching a video, and it said this was the first module that can do reverse DSC, so reverse desired state config. So we can go pull the configuration out of the tenant, which is pretty damn awesome. So you can just see up here on the right, I've exported a Teams message policy is the one. So we can choose to export an entire tenant if we want, or we can choose to export individual elements. And I'll take you through what that looks like in terms of how we'd achieve that. I haven't gone for any live demos today because I always fear the demo gods, and I haven't prepared enough for that one. So I can just take you through how you'd achieve it. It's the nice thing. For me, you can see on the right, we're just doing a Teams messaging policy. And how might we achieve that? There's kind of two approaches to kind of getting a config export out from using M365 DSC. Both are PowerShell driven. There used to be like a legacy UI, like a wizard that we had. But nowadays it's purely PowerShell, and we have kind of, the first one is unattended export, so you can just run a command and it'll dump it all out. The second one is that they have a web-based UI to help generate export code. So you can pick and choose the elements you wish to export out. And whoever built this one did a wonderful job. But you've got the export web UI. This was awesome when I was playing with it. We can choose to export elements of our 365 tenant and dump out the configuration. So you can see here we've got Azure AD, for example. I've ticked a few boxes because I just want to extract the Azure AD config for a tenant that I have. And you can see this is the one that it generates for me. So it comes up with some lovely text about generated by. It basically asks you to get the credential, and it will export using the credentials that you specify. So you can see we're exporting all those components that are Azure AD driven. The next one we've got up is report. So how can I report on a configuration or a tenant I have? And basically, we can generate a report for a tenant. Now, this one is probably better suited for users that aren't really comfortable with PS1 files or PowerShell files. The key here is that we want to basically make it easier for people to understand, I guess is probably the best way of putting it. We can dump out an existing configuration using DSC, using HTML file, so Edge, for example, or we've got Excel, so you can dump it out to an XLSX spreadsheet. So we can use that to basically generate an easier to consume, I guess, report for people that are coming to look at the tenant. Now, I've just beamed up a sample HTML report that I took off the M365 DSC. What we can see here is that it's got basically a few settings, and yeah, like I said, it's primarily for people that basically are not comfortable reading the PS1 file or the JSON. And, you know, it's an easy way to do that. I think with Excel, you can generate reports. It's probably the easy one. But again, I would probably just stick to the PS1, so I probably wouldn't use this functionality as much. The next one, now this is really quite a powerful one in terms of the ability and what you can do with it. For me, one of the key ones that we've got is the ability to clone between tenants is the one. So using DSC, we can take kind of configuration and we can apply that from tenant A to tenant B. I think some of the use cases that we might want to kind of use this for are primarily, and I'm thinking it through, if you're using like an MSP, you may have a whole bunch of different tenants that you want to configure in the same manner. It could be that you're working on a reproduction of an issue, like a test. You want to build a test tenant, for example. We can quickly and easily clone settings from one tenant and move it to another. And again, we're just using the tool. What we're really doing is pulling a config or exporting a config, and we're going to apply that config to the next tenant. Now, the cool thing here is that we can use this to basically either do a full tenant, or we can choose individual elements. So if you wanted to do the team settings or the SharePoint settings, we can do that, and you can pick and choose, like we saw previously. If you wanted to do something specific, we can go choose that specific export and basically pull that out and apply that to a different tenant. Now, for me, that's one of the real key ones in terms of getting that consistency. We can easily, you know, apply a bunch of settings to a different tenant. And again, this gets really powerful when you start blueprinting tenants, or you have kind of a standard baseline that you want to apply to your tenancies. That's where I think this becomes really powerful in terms of a tool. Just a second, hold on. Ooh. Cool. And again, I've just drawn up a quick command example of how we might achieve this. You can see in this one, we're going to connect to one tenant. We're going to pull the Azure AD groups naming policy. So if you have a naming policy for Azure AD groups, we can export that and you dump that out to a file. At that point, we're going to connect to the second tenant, and we're basically going to update the Azure AD group naming policy. So you can see we're just taking a component from one tenant and applying it to another. Now, one thing you might note is the credentials that we're using. We're just using get credential. I think it was a bit more painful back in the day when not all PowerShell modules basically supported service principals. It was a lot more painful because you get the MFA prompt. Nowadays, I think there's 3 different ways we can authenticate using DSC. I think we've got your standard kind of username and password. We can do via certificate, or we can do via an Azure AD application. So we've got 3 different ways of connecting. And using those last 2, certificate and say the Azure AD application, that'll make your life a lot easier in terms of kind of automating that. And I think that's where the real value can come. I've got kind of a real world example of how this might hang together towards the end. Again, actually, let's go. So that's kind of the clone. The next one, again, is a really quite powerful one, and it's, again, built in. So the guys at the M365 DSC team have done a real wonderful job here in terms of kind of the tool and technology they put out there. But the idea here is that we can do deltas between tenants. And again, this is really good for blueprint, or for, sorry, baselining and understanding, I guess, configuration drift between time or tenants is the great thing. So again, the way this one works is that we can basically pull those desired state configs using the tool. Basically, maybe in this example, I've got from tenant A and tenant B, or it could be tenant A and tenant A at different timelines. And the key here is that we can use the tool to take those kind of configuration files and compare them. And at that point, we can use that to produce a Delta report. So you can see here another one that I pulled from the website. And you've got here is basically, it tells you what are the resources that are configured differently. And for me, this one's quite a simple one. Mail tips, all tips enabled true, and it's changed to false. So we can quickly and easily identify configuration drift is the key thing. And that's why compare is very powerful. I think another one is, say you have, maybe back in COVID times, we had, a lot of people that need to stand up teams quickly, or, they might want to spin up groups or sharing settings, something of that nature, and they might not have all done it to best practice is the one. You could export what you think is probably the best configuration, a safe configuration, and you can use this to compare it across all those different tenants that you may have. Now, of course, you could go and apply that using the tool, like the automate step, and we could just apply that configuration to them. Or we could use this just to see what needs to be changed, manually if we want. So we can highlight the changes and either give it to maybe the admins that run that, or alternatively, you could automatically apply that setting. Now, I appreciate I've flown through this one quite quickly, but I think we've got some good stuff here in terms of putting it all together as the one. So I think that's kind of the tool, and those are the 6 kind of pillars that we have. I think for me, what does this actually enable us to do? What does kind of the end state look like? And for me, this is kind of the dream scenario that we could do. And this is kind of DevOps, so plus M365 DSC. So what we're really trying to do here, and I'll probably just talk you through what it is and how it's supposed to hang together. But, in a perfect world, this is probably how you tackle it. Now, there is a white paper out there. This is not my own work. I've got it linked in the references, but they tell you step by step how to set this sort of stuff up. Now, the guys that did this, I think the 2 premier field engineers at Microsoft, I got a shout at them towards the end. But the work that they've done, they've got a detailed guide on how to set it up. But the approach is what I like, because it takes a DevOps kind of approach to Microsoft 365. Now, I doubt this is going to be for everyone, but it's pretty darn cool. So the idea here is that you have, Azure Devops up and running. We have a Git repo that we can version control our config files. The idea here is in the bottom left, we've got the admin. He's going to add, modify, and delete. He's going to update his master config file. At that point, he's created it in a fork in Git, and he's going to basically push that into the repo. At that point, we have a build pipeline. It's going to basically check the pull. It's going to create the pull request. We're going to check the pull request, basically check that what we're submitting, we can automate the tests against that and make sure that it's going to build successfully. At that point, it's going to land at the main repository for some code review, and if we want to merge that branch into ours. The idea here is that we have some quality control of what changes we're going to make. So for me, it could be that we're changing the Sharepoint sharing setting again. And the idea here is that, we're going to go change it from existing guests to new and existing guests. The idea here is using Git, we can easily see in text the exact setting we're looking to change on the tenant. And basically the idea there is it's just code. We can easily see the difference in kind of the text file, and that's going to be highlighted as part of that pull request. It's going to say we're changing this value to that. Yeah, there's no real UI to click through or fumble about with. The idea here is that we're going to basically see that. And if those guys are happy, code review and merge the pull requests, what it's going to do is we got a pipeline in Azure Devops. It's going to compile the DSC files, and they end up in a format called a MOF. It's going to go to the build pipeline next. It's going to grab our credentials, our certificate, our service principal, whatever it may be. It's going to grab that from our key vault. It's going to deploy that across, and we can deploy it to our staging environment first and foremost. In this example, we're going to deploy it to staging. Again, typically what I would look to do is we can have multiple environments if you want, but the key there is we want a kind of a release gate or a gate in our pipeline to check that it's going to be suitable before we apply that to our production tenant. So we can change the text file. We've got all the pipelines set up. It's going to rock and roll and basically get us to a point where we apply it to staging. At that point, we'll have our admins go verify the setting's been applied successfully and we're happy with it. And then at that point, we would look to pull the trigger and move it to deploy and move it to our production tenant. And to me, that's probably the nirvana. I don't know who could, how many people actually get there. I think it's an awesome use of the technology and how we might achieve that. Now, the real world example I'd like to give, this is the one that I really like the look of. So it's kind of taking what we've seen in the previous one, which is kind of the whole pipeline scenario. We're using infrastructure as code, Microsoft 365 DSC. We've got Git as our source control, and basically we're making use of kind of pipelines, key vaults, different environments. We can take this, and the real world example that I love is kind of a conditional access one. And it's by my man Klaus, and he's going to have to forgive me if he actually sees this, but the name Jespersen, I'm guessing that's how you pronounce it, but I put conditional access hero. This guy is too good at conditional access, but the great thing he did, I would say, in the last couple of weeks was that they made a guide on how to deploy his kind of conditional access rule set using Microsoft 365 DSC. And there's two DSC configs to apply. One is the CA groups, so the first one creates the groups, and the second one is the CA rules, so it creates the rules after that. And I'm pretty sure I saw the DevOps element around that as well. So he's built out a whole rule set of kind of conditional access rules. It comes with a lovely spreadsheet. Again, these are linked in the resources, so you can have a look at the references, and it can link through to that GitHub. You can have a look. And at that point, what you've got is the ability to basically rapidly deploy his kind of best practice conditional access rules, which to me, if I'm working with a customer, working with a new tenant, you probably want a baseline of your conditional access policies and how that might work. Yeah. And for me, this is probably the quickest and easiest way, because I've used some other ones out there where we use Graph API to import the JSON. But again, it's all defined up front for us, and it makes it very easy to deploy the best practice, real world example of kind of conditional access policies. So for me, yeah, he's done a fantastic job on the CA rules, but also to add to that, you've got that DSC config on top of it. Now, what are the key tooling? I mean, for me, the key tooling here is that we've got VS Code is probably what you're going to have to be familiar with. So, if you're familiar with VS Code PS1, that's probably my text editor of choice. You're probably going to want to use Azure AD as another key tool, and that's really authentication. So the ability to either authenticate username, certificate, or kind of service principal. Those are probably, I would always go with the service principal or the certificate-based authentication. And the key reason is you probably don't want, the key reason being is if you run, say, DSC on a laptop or a server and you do the credential-based one, and it's going to poll every 15 minutes as part of that DSC job, it's going to be prompting you for MFA. And certainly if you're going to do it in a DevOps scenario or anything like that, you're going to want to use an unattended kind of authentication mechanism. The next one is Git, and that's really quite key. It is part of Azure DevOps, but with GitHub becoming more and more prominent, that's probably one to consider as to where it lives. So whether you use Azure DevOps kind of pipelines or you use GitHub Actions, longer term, it is a decision. But I think the key thing there is the version control of this. Because it's plain text files, you probably just want the ability to quickly be able to differentiate and see the changes between different versions. And that's why you chuck it in Git, really. Obviously, one of the main ones is PowerShell, because it's all built on PowerShell DSC. So without that, you're not going to be able to do much. And the bottom right is kind of Azure DevOps. And again, Azure DevOps is probably the choice for this at the moment, but it's really the pipelines and kind of that automated build, release process and how you achieve that. So you want that in a repeatable fashion. Again, that's consistent. And again, if you start looking at DevOps pipelines, you're going to end up in another infrastructure as code scenario where you have your pipelines designed in YAML is the thing, so it's going to be laid out in text. So you can get really deep into the rabbit hole of infrastructure as code. I think one of my failings is probably I spend too long trying to build everything out as infrastructure as code, as opposed to actually just cracking on at some point. So yeah, DevOps is primarily going to be there for your pipelines, and we threw in some Iron Brew just as a joke to keep you going. Now the other thing I would say is this is probably the only kind of open source project or tooling I've seen that is available for kind of infrastructure as code for Microsoft 365. There is paid offerings out there, and one of the ones I came across I think was Simeon Cloud, and they had very much the same kind of idea, but that was a paid one, and that again was very interesting in terms of how they approached it. I think theirs was more Terraform based as opposed to DSC, which is what we're looking at, so it's another interesting take on it. I think the big one for me though is the longer term viability of DSC. So where are we going with PowerShell DSC? I'm not entirely sure. That they said they're picking up work again on it, so I'm hopeful that DSC picks back up steam and this one keeps going. That was kind of it for me today, so I appreciate I am, well, 10 minutes shorter than I wanted to be. I wanted to go for about 40, but that's fine. I think I wanted to say a big special thanks to a number of people. I called out Nessie here. We got a big special thanks to the Microsoft 365 DSC team. Without them, none of this would be possible. The main man, and he's going to have to forgive me, but Nick Charblos, I'm going to go with that, just wing it. But he seems to be the main man on all of this, and he seems to have carried the whole project. He's a PFE, a Premier Field Engineer, again at Microsoft. So a lot of people I call out, I think all the 4 individuals on the slide are from Microsoft. You've got the 2 in the bottom left, Jordan and Yorick. Those are the guys that do that kind of white paper around setting up the Azure Devops. And you've got Klaus for the conditional access. And of course, a big thanks to Scottish Summit for actually having me here and talking. My references are in the slide deck. I have to run it through the accessibility check, and then I'll get it over to you guys, and you guys can have a look at all the references. But they're kind of all the different elements I used to put the deck together today. So the examples that I've called out, you'll find in there. And again, the final one I would say is a big thank you to our sponsors. Again, without them, none of this would be possible. So again, thanks for that. And as it's the first time I'm actually demoing this content, I would love to know what you thought of the session, what was missing, what would have made it better, what elements did you like, what didn't you? If you could leave me some feedback in the session or in the Scottish Summit app, that would be awesome. That was it for me today. Yeah, I finished a couple minutes earlier than I wanted, but that's okay. Thanks very much for listening. It's the end session, so we'll give you some of your time back. I guess any questions over to the audience. Oh, shoot, sorry.
I have a question. So regarding DSC, how would you describe the difference to Terraform?
Oh, gosh. To be honest, I would have to do a bit more digging, but at the end of the day, it is relatively similar, is the thing. I don't actually have an easy answer to that one.
I would say it's like...
Go on then.
I would say, see, Terraform is more like you can obviously do demolition, you can destroy it, you can recover.
Oh, yeah, that's a good shout, yeah.
So it's more of like, it's along the same lines that you said earlier, it's not DSC, Terraform. But I think there's a lot more you can do with Terraform than what you can do with with DSC.
Yeah, you probably are right in terms of that one. Sorry.
I actually got the reverse because from the presentation, the quoting the tenants and all that. I don't see that like the Terraform, because Terraform like.
I think the main difference is with Terraform you build from scratch. Like you normally build from scratch and you landing zone and stuff like that. Whereas DSC, you're normally copying content that's already been there. You don't really build from scratch.
You see, I would challenge that one because I know with Terraform, I can certainly import configurations in. So say we're working with Terraform and VMware, I can ingest a kind of an existing configuration. I think DSC typically doesn't have that. I think this is the only module that does the reverse DSC, as it were. I think DSC, we can't really do that ingestion. But you're right, certainly, in terms of the destroy, lift up, I don't really think that's a component of this one. I think...
It's not. I think it's where it traditionally sits as well. Where's DSC traditionally sits?
So DSC traditionally sits with PowerShell, is really where it's at. So it's a Windows-based one. Terraform is multi-cloud, multi-vendor, is the idea of Terraform. Whereas, this is purely...
Yeah, I was thinking more from it's more like improving your application, building your ID controllers.
Yep.
That sort of thing. It's inside where Terraform is building your infrastructure. So DSC, I think, is on cars and building a house or something like that.
Yeah.
Putting your sofa in.
Okay. Well, yeah, for me...
I like that analogy, actually.
Well, I think
it's a different house, though. It's a flat.
I think you got me along the right lines. I like the thinking of that. But, I mean, DSC's come from a Windows background. That's really what I would think. Terraform is, cloud agnostic, multi-cloud. That's another thing that's got going for Terraform versus, say, DSC. Because DSC, I think they are translating it to be more, PowerShell core driven. Because at the moment, it's kind of Windows only, really is the important thing. But I read recently that they're picking it back up to move to more, I guess, PowerShell 7, as we call it now, as opposed to PowerShell core.
And why would we go for DSC then?
Well, why would you go for DSC?
Yeah.
I'll tell you why, because it's kind of the only show in town, really, is the thing. If you want to do 365, yeah, I mean, if I could do Terraform with M365, you know, I would probably do a different session today.
Could we create like a module in Terraform?
Oh, God.
I think there's kind of connectors. I don't use that.
You can do, I'm pretty sure you can do modules, but I think that, well, I see this gentleman's nodding his head, so he might have a better idea than me, but, you know, I think there are ways of building out different modules, as it were, or the functionality, because I use a provider, I think is the term I'm looking for. So I use a VMware provider when I'm doing VMware Terraform or an Azure provider. I think the problem is you'd have to find someone to build kind of an M365 provider, as it were, whereas this is the way that we've got available to us now, so that's probably why I'd go with this.
Nice weekend.
Well, hey, if you can do it on a weekend, I would love to play with it, is what I would say. I would be ecstatic to play with it, because I'm more familiar with Terraform, in all honesty. But I love the idea and the kind of concept of kind of infrastructure as code and applying that to 365. So that's why this project has really sparked an interest in me, because, you know, there wasn't really much out there. You can write scripts, you know, the imperative scripts, you know, I want to set up a tenant, I want to set these settings. But that they change over time. Like we said, you know, modules change, authentication mechanisms change, settings and names might change. We rename, you know, different kind of admin centers. The setting used to be set over here, is now set over there. I like the declarative approach of just saying, this is what I want my tenant to look like, and these are the settings I wish to apply. Yeah, sorry.
And would you recommend setting up users?
So it's a good question, and no, I don't think I would. I think for me, I would draw the line, and again, there is an important note in there. I wouldn't do users with this, no. I think it's too fluid. I think there's a separation of duty, really, or a separation. No, I wouldn't go for that, is the thing. I probably wouldn't go for that one. And all right, well, let me break it down how I approach this one typically. I think for me, I look at it in two ways. There's the kind of content and structure of your tenant, and the data or the content within your tenant. And for me, you know, I think users are content or data. You may want to do your break glass accounts, for example. You could do them possibly using this, because you probably have those everywhere you go. You probably want some break glass accounts, yeah. But for me, you know, standard users, no, we'll leave that be. That's content or data, as you want to put it. It's not really structure or configuration. So that's where I'd draw the line. And again, the one that I would think about, you know, the only things I'd really touch in terms of that are, you know, if you have an intranet, you have a, you know, with learning pathways, Microsoft Sharepoint site, you might want to provision that on every tenant you do. But I don't really want to be messing with people's SharePoint sites. Yeah, I don't want to be dealing with the data side of things. It may be that you want to do kind of a provisioning process for a team or a SharePoint site, and we apply those baseline settings. You know, this has guest access switched off, this has guest access switched on. I would use it at that level, but probably no lower than that. That's probably the limit I would go. So it's really about configuration and structure.
No, I think it's a bit more general. I'm thinking of what's the need of creating a tenant like regularly, or is there any? Can you give an example of a situation where you need to deploy? Because for my company, we have a fixed set of tenants. And
Yeah, okay.
we usually don't spin up tenants.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. So yeah, there is a limit, and I think the scenarios for me where this really shines are probably going to be MSP space, so managed service providers who are managing multiple tenants at any given time. So I work, for example, one of my contracts at the moment, I work for an MSP, and we manage, you know, 10, 15 tenants, and for us to have the same setting across all of them would be fantastic. I think another one is people might have an issue with production, and they want to mess with another tenant. So this is more your scenario. Say we have a tenant, we've got a problem in our tenant. We might just spin up a development tenant free from Microsoft and apply our settings and test it out. Yeah, and
that's a good challenge actually.
yeah, because that's more the scenario for you. Because I appreciate a lot of people might not be a consultant, work for an MSP. They might not deal with, you know, 20, 30, 50 tenants, whatever it is. That's probably the scenario that would work probably better for you.
I think auditability as well. For somebody, if you've got an external auditor coming in,
Oh man, can you go? It just gets me excited. Can you imagine how cool it would be?
to go through a list of settings rather than having to navigate through a portal.
Exactly,
It's massive.
because day in, day out, I'm doing checks against the NCSC kind of compliance. You know, they have a blueprint how they set out to configure Microsoft 365. Imagine if I could walk up to a tenant and say, we use kind of the export and probably the compare feature of DSC, and we say these are the settings that are not in. I mean, it just blows your mind how cool that would be. I mean,
I've been thinking for this, I can create a health check based on this.
exactly.
Yeah.
The possibilities here are fantastic. It really is kind of powerful tech is the one. So, yeah, the ability to spit out an audit, like you said, that's pretty much spot on. And just have a look. And imagine you put that in Git next, yeah? And you can see quickly and easily, we can see the diff between them, green and red. We can easily highlight that. And on top of that, the really cool one is we can have release, you know, from an auditability perspective. This is the date and time we made this change, and this is the reason we did it, and that can go with the pull request that goes into Git.
Your reviews as well.
Exactly. So you have that kind of auditability. You have the approval in place. I mean, for me, if I could get this everywhere, I'd absolutely love it. It's just so much, well, infrastructure as code. And I think, you know, I was reading, when I was prepping for this session, I was reading about infrastructure as data. Seems to be the new one. I got to learn what that is and understand what on earth, you know, what is that? Because they're saying infrastructure as code is old. I'm like, oh man, I've just come up with this one. We've got infrastructure as data next. So that's the next one I got to learn about. So I don't really know what that one is yet, but I'm excited to have a read. Go for it.
Do you use sort of tenant migrations for auditing that approach?
Yeah.
As part of that too?
So you want to do a tenant-to-tenant migration? Was that the scenario?
Yeah.
Well,
So you know, companies.
Yep, okay.
And you've got to start
Well,
taking them from-
I actually listened to the guy, Nick, I listened to a video he did, and they actually did the exact scenario you're talking about, because they had I think it was a Canadian company, if I remember correctly from the video, and they wanted to migrate from one region to another, and they basically spun up a new tenant, chucked the settings out, and deployed it to the other tenant, and then migrated across. Now, obviously, there is some complexity about the migration in terms of the actual data, but the configuration and structure would be the same, which is pretty damn cool.
Yeah, I wouldn't touch that.
I was just thinking of it from an auditing point of view.
I mean, if you're going to go for like, if you want to like migrate some config, then okay. But as you said, I wouldn't touch users and like.
Oh yeah, no.
Worry about object GUIs,
Oh, sorry.
that type of stuff.
Maybe I missed the one, but yeah, we don't want to touch the content. We'll touch the structure and the configuration. But I wouldn't touch, like John said, we don't want any data. No, we can't use it for that. At the moment, it's purely around structure and config.
GitTight do all that themselves.
Well, exactly. Then you probably get third-party tooling to kind of. I would use it to set up the kind of. You got the as is. We'd copy that into the 2B, and we'd migrate the content using third-party tooling probably. Sorry, go for it.
I love that. I think it's really good. One question, you may have cut out.
Yeah.
If I was an MSP with about 10 clients, what permissions do you require those clients? Because you're saying don't use a user account.
Yeah.
If I have a config pipeline, how am I authenticating?
Okay. Yeah. So that one's an easy one. Thankfully, that's probably the easiest question we've had yet. I would. I would probably use an Azure Id app. Yeah, like a service principal, and you can spin one up. Again, there's some lovely PowerShell out there that people have written, but again, you can use this to define Azure AD apps, but you're kind of in a chicken and egg scenario. But an Azure AD app, a service principal, is a way of authenticating against a tenant using, an app, more modern technology. So we can use a certificate and say this is our application ID, our secret, and our client. Or did I miss did I?
understand all that.
Okay, where did I go wrong?
Okay, say when it changes the site state, let's say Sharepoint sharing one tenancy.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
You only definitely have a global admin.
Oh,
Has permission to do that. So I have permission. How do I change that? Was it a case of export the template, give the customer a bid, or customer
I see.
change it?
Okay, so, yeah, okay. So it's more that you don't have permission to the tenant that you want to apply it to? Okay, I get it now. So apologies, it's not the easiest one. Yeah, so you can just do it. You could just get a global admin, yeah? Or it could be a SharePoint Online administrator. I'm pretty sure the way it works is you only need access to the area that you want to change. So if you want to change SharePoint Online, for example, you could export the SharePoint settings. You could export the SharePoint sharing settings. It depends on the granularity you want to go. You can export that out using Global Reader or SharePoint Admin. Yeah, so if you're exporting, Global Read will do. Yeah, Global Reader if you're going for authenticated, so not using a certificate or a service principal. At that point, you could just pass it across to their SharePoint Admin and they could import it. Yeah.
In an ideal world, brilliant, but some of the customers work with, because they don't have that permission around the flow, so they almost expect it from us, and we don't change it, we're not global admin, we will use these.
Yeah.
Here the settings, maybe on the board review, okay, this is when we change this, change that, change this. One customer saying, yeah, do it, but most customers wouldn't. So
Okay, well,
Could you use the service principle to make changes.
So look, there's a few different ones there that I'll probably tackle. Probably the first and foremost, you know, if you want to present a report or a findings, yeah, we can use that kind of the report functionality with a compare and say these are the settings you need to change, yeah, and they can go change it manually. Alternatively, I would go for the service principal. If I would probably just I'd create an Azure Id app with all the permissions that I want to make the changes and have them approve it. Yeah, that's probably the simplistic way. Or if I got completely off piece.
Related to this question, would you need separate instances of this DSC solution in order to authenticate to multiple clients?
So for multiple clients, you would need an Azure AD app or a service principal for each one. Yeah, that's how it works, because you can't just grant yourself. Yeah.
Could you have multiple app tenants using one
Yes.
S365 DSC?
So you could. But the challenge there is you'd have to have the same config across all of them. But again, in an MSP scenario, that would work. You would just have to configure a pipeline to run for, you know, different tenants and different credentials for each one that you connect to. Yes.
You can copy the MOC anyway to
Yeah. So you can copy the config file, or we could just set up the pipeline to authenticate to different tenants using different credentials. So the pipelines would allow you to do that. Sorry, is that all right? Yeah. You can always come speak to me afterwards. That's no bother. And I'll probably talk you through what I'm thinking. Sorry, you've been waiting forever. Apologies.
That's fine. So, two of the modules that are using the DSC that are expiring.
The Azure AD and all that. So Azure AD is going to go. I think they pushed it back to, is it August, I think is the latest I read. So
Have they intimated that they're going to update it to Graph?
but they are incorporating more and more of the graph is the important thing. So I feel like they will probably incorporate that. They seem pretty active. I looked at the GitHub repo recently. But yeah, they do stay abreast of those kind of module depreciations, and they incorporate it. So for example, that Exchange Online Management came in when we got finally modern authentication with Exchange. They incorporated that, and we can get rid of the old one, thank goodness. Same with Skype for Business. You know, we used to, in DSC back in, I think, 2020, we had Skype for Business and Teams doing both things, you know, both PowerShell modules. It's now Teams and Graph is the important thing. So I think they'll probably move, this is, you know, I can't speak on behalf of the DSC team, but I'd imagine they're going to gravitate more and more towards Graph, because that's the central API management endpoint for Microsoft, you know, 365. So that's probably where most things will end up. And again, if you're using Intune, Graph, you know, I'm hopeful that where most things will end up. But I know we're waiting on some license changes for that Azure AD one. I thought they're doing some new stuff there. But yeah, they should incorporate that.
So there's another caveat here, and this is not supported by Microsoft.
This, yeah, 100%. You know, this is an open source, 100% open source initiative. But I mean, the stuff that it's built on, you know, PowerShell PnP I've been using for years, you know, it is 100%, you know, not supported by Microsoft. It's an open source initiative. If you want that supported offering, you probably go to the paid providers like Simian Cloud, for example. That's the only other one I know that really offers this kind of functionality.
And I also did offer up the configs from the DSC output to NCC for a cyber essentials.
Oh, really? They didn't want to do it. Well, you know, typically when I'm doing the NCSC evaluations, it's me evaluating the 10. Yeah, I don't really pass it to NCSC. I would typically go.
So NCC is an audit company.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
They said no. They said no interest. Well, I mean, you're probably too ahead of the curve for them then, in all honesty. You know, for me, if you're doing these audits day in and day out, you probably just want to see a text file of the settings. You don't want to go through every admin portal, because I know I do it enough that it drives me around the bend, because I have to remember each and every single admin portal, where I've got to click, and, you know, how I've got to find it, and what should that setting be. So it's crazy, eh? I don't understand it.
Something that should, because APIs are going to fail the company because it's not a supported tool. In this area, we don't accept this.
But Microsoft doesn't, what you're saying, Microsoft don't support it.
Yeah.
So Microsoft is never going to support, you probably don't ever need Microsoft support for it anyway, to be honest. Like,
It's an open source initiative. It's an active and open source initiative. It's probably the other key thing. You don't, you know, I look to use open source initiatives that are active, have, you know, contribution going on, and have clear ownership. So PnP is one of my favorite. That's absolutely awesome. But yeah, you're never going to get Microsoft support for it. But the key is it's using the supported Microsoft APIs behind the scenes.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's
So
not.
What was the problem?
the auditing company wouldn't take his text file
Yeah.
as a backup to what he's done.
What did they want?
What does he be doing?
Exactly. So,
That's
this,
the same with screenshots.
exactly. This gentleman's too far ahead of the curve is the problem. And I mean, half the settings that you want, say for SharePoint, I know when I'm doing the NCSC check, you can't even get to in the UI at the moment. So, I mean,
In terms of support as well, just going back to that, like the guys on Twitter are really good. So like,
Yeah.
if you do have any issues or anything like that, then they are good at getting back to you. I've had, don't need to bring you afraid, I've had a load of issues with the DSC in the past, like where things don't work properly. Like when you do the export, the MFC doesn't appear.
MOF,
And then you've
yeah.
got to then export everything in individual parts and play with the back-end file to actually get it to work. But
Yeah.
it does the job.
and to be fair, I would probably break the config up into different elements, you know, because again, it depends how often you want to check these elements or what you want to do with them in terms of the alerting function or the configuration drift.
And if you've got a problem, also report it on the GitHub. as
Of
well.
course, yeah.
As well, yeah.
Just one thing, you mentioned MOC. What does
That-
that stand for?
I think it's MOF is the one. So when you run DSC, it compiles the file into an MOF file, and it's I don't actually know what that abbreviation is, but
Yeah, very.
it's basically the DSC file. It's what it puts out. Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for the questions because you kind of kept it going for me. It was very exciting. Well,
Well, you said that you wanted it to be longer.
well, I also want feedback, so things to incorporate kind of in the next version of, or the iteration of do of this. Yeah, if you could leave us anything in the app, it would be much appreciated. Apologies for keeping it even longer. I appreciate it on the last session of the day. So thanks for coming to see me. Yeah, thanks very much for your help, ladies. It's appreciated. Cool.